Let's see. I see is the order of the papers okay with all the people who are presenting? And what shall we do? One paper each, or two papers and then discussion and then two more papers, or discussion after every paper, or save to the end? Mikael, what do you think?
I don't know. Maybe in the end we can discuss 4 papers. I don't know what Matthew thinks. So for me, it's okay if we discuss the 4 at the end.
That sounds fine to me too.
Okay.
I don't know, Greg, do you have a preference? Awesome beard, by the way. Really appreciate it.
Yes, Greg, I didn't see.
It's my pandemic beard. My barber has been closed for the whole year, so that's my excuse.
You did that intentionally. Don't lie about that.
Both things can be true.
Good. And let's see. Juan Ignacio is here.
Not yet. But he should be here in any moment. So I'm going to WhatsApp him.
Okay.
Maybe
and I see that.
That maybe he has some technical issue, but no.
Okay. And I see that my paper is listed twice, so it's the first one and then the fourth one, I guess. Let's see. And then Juan Ignacio and then Matt. I can start with my paper, and then we'll go to Juan Ignacio, or if he's not there yet, we'll go to Matt. Is it helpful if I put up my paper on the screen? Or
yeah, yes, maybe it is. Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Share my screen. Awesome. Okay, so my paper is about Plato's Apology, and I originally asked the question, what kind of friend was Socrates? I felt myself leaning towards the second question, what kind of teacher was Socrates? Certainly in the Apology, but I hope to bring the two together. So in Plato's Apology, Socrates defends his way of life as a philosopher and elaborates on his relationship with the city of Athens. In this paper, I hope to show that as a teacher, Socrates' relationship with the city may be considered as a form of friendship. This might sound odd. After all, Athens was about to convict him for living the philosophical life, and Socrates himself describes himself as a gadfly to the city. And of course, friends can be annoying sometimes, but a gadfly is always annoying. This is hardly the image of a friend. Yet there are strong indications that Socrates viewed himself as a friend to the city. I'll first clarify what kind of teacher Socrates was in order to show how this kind of teaching may be considered as a form of friendship. My paper will address the question of payment for teaching services and the question of inequality between teacher and student. In the Apology, Socrates, as a teacher, distinguishes himself from the sophists. Sophists were itinerant teachers who sold their philosophies and arts, such as rhetoric, to well-to-do young Athenians. Originally, sophists were held to be wise men. Homer and Pericles were considered sophos, or wise. In Plato's time, however, itinerant teachers such as Gorgias, Prodicus, and Hippias were also called sophists. They were successful and charismatic, but there was a sense that their naturalist philosophies and their rhetorical techniques, which tended to separate persuasive speaking from morality, were undermining the morals of the city. Nevertheless, Socrates was accused of being this kind of teacher. The earliest accusation, he says, is that he is like a sophist, and that he has theories about the heavens and has investigated everything below the earth and can make the weaker argument defeat the stronger. When Socrates, however, emphasizes that he is not like the sophist, the the payment issue plays a large part in his argumentation. The sophists were, and I quote, perfectly capable of going into any city and actually persuading the young men to leave the company of their fellow citizens, with any of whom they can associate for nothing, attach themselves to him, pay money for the privilege, and be grateful into the bargain. By contrast, Socrates argues that he has never charged a fee for his conversations. His witness to this way of life is his poverty. Socrates makes 3 points on the role of payment in teaching. First, he argues that he has nothing to sell by means of his teaching. The sophists claimed that they had special philosophical or technical knowledge that would benefit their students, which would warrant charging a fee. By contrast, Socrates argues that he does not possess a systematic body of knowledge, such as a theory about the cosmos or a certain technique. Indeed, he says that he has no interest in these things and denies having any kind of positive wisdom. In fact, his only wisdom is that he realizes that in respect to wisdom, he's really worthless. He claims to have never imparted any teaching to anybody, and specifically, he never made any student privy to some kind of private knowledge that would not be accessible otherwise. Moreover, Socrates renounces rhetoric. He speaks plainly in court and refrains from playing on the emotions of the jury. As other Socratic dialogues show, his model of education is based on personal conversations in which the student, not the teacher, is the protagonist in the learning process. Also, in the Apology, we see Socrates acting in a way that may be considered as teaching, but not as selling a product. Rather, Socratic education is related to ethical admonishment or moral encouragement. Throughout the Apology, Socrates refers to a kind of scolding. Are you not ashamed that you give your attention to acquiring as much money as possible, and similarly with reputation and honor, and give no attention or thought to truth and understanding and the perfection of your soul? He tells the jury. He orders his fellow Athenians to make their chief concern not for your body or for your possessions, but for the highest welfare of your souls. Wealth does not bring goodness, but goodness brings wealth and every other blessing, both to the individual and to the polis. He continues to say, let no day pass without discussing goodness and all the other subjects about which you hear me talking and examining both myself and others is really the very best thing that a man can do. And that life without this sort of examination is not worth living. Socrates is critiquing the Athenian way of life. And this comes across as a kind of reprimand or rebuke. The closest image of Socrates' relationship to the city here is that of a parent scolding a child. Socrates makes this comparison explicitly when he says that he neglected his own affairs by busying himself all the time on your behalf, going like a father or an elder brother to see each one of you privately and urging you to set your thoughts on goodness. Fittingly, the Apology ends by asking the people of Athens to raise his own sons and reproach them. So Socrates asks the people of Athens to raise his sons and reproach them. However, just like a son does not pay his father for providing good advice, so it would make no sense for Socrates to charge a fee. Partly because, as Socrates states, his admonishments are simple, straightforward, and moral. They are not contrived, so to speak. Socrates does not say things that are so uniquely complicated that one would have to pay for them. This, of course, contrasts with the sophistic approach that claimed to have a product to sell. Secondly, not only does Socrates have nothing to sell, his arguments also help us see that payment introduces ulterior motives into the educative process. For Socrates, motivations on the part of the teacher, such as money, but also esteem or reputation, interfere with the educative process. Indeed, Socrates repeatedly claims in the Apology that his teaching is a disinterested or selfless service to the city. The immediate benefit is to the student, not to himself. The father-son image clarifies this. A father's admonishments are meant to benefit the child. By contrast, should the child pay the father for raising him, a father might be more inclined to say or do what the child wants. Thirdly, if payment and reputation are not the proper rewards of teaching, then what is? One might conclude that there's no reward, but effectively, there is an important benefit that accrues to Socrates and to any Socratic teacher. In his cross-examination of Meletus, Socrates asks whether it is better to live in a good or in a bad community. Is it not true that wicked people do harm to those with whom they are in closest contact, and that good people have a good effect? The father-child analogy is once again helpful here. Of course, there's a cost, we can say, to raising a child and raising him well. But just as it is hell to live with a spoiled child, so it's even more hellish to live with spoiled adults. The benefit of raising a child well is not financial, it's relational. In short, the effect that the teacher has by means of a certain kind of teaching on the community in the long run always profits the teacher himself as well. The sophists who traveled to Athens in order to make money, but who did not live and die in the city of Athens, were less sensitive to the effect that they had on the community. But Socrates, who points out in another dialogue that he never left the city except for a brief military expedition, recognizes that his well-being and his life depend on the moral rectitude of the city and its members. Another question is whether the parent-child analogy that I've alluded to several times now applies to the teacher-student relationship as a form of friendship. Whereas friendship might seem to depend on equality, the parent-child analogy introduces an element of inequality. However, as Aristotle argued in the Nicomachean Ethics, there can also be friendship when there's inequality between the parties. In this case, friendship needs to be based on proportional reciprocity. From the Nicomachean Ethics, the virtue and function of each of these is different, and so are the reasons for which they love. The love and the friendship are therefore different also. Aristotle continues with, each party then neither gets the same from the other, nor ought to seek it. In other words, in an unequal relationship, the rewards are also unequal. We may think of the relationship between a parent and a child, which is unequal, but can still be a relationship of friendship, even though the rewards of the friendship are different. In the same way, the Socratic teacher may be an unequal friend to the student, acting in a disinterested way, whereby the main benefit accrues to the student, not the teacher. Okay, no matter the uniqueness of Socratic experiences, these extracts from the Apology allow us to reflect on certain aspects of education today. First, education is not and should not exclusively be about providing students with knowledge that consists of theories that are memories and applied. Moreover, education is not and should not be purely transactional. Education is about encouraging students to live the examined life and providing them with a role model of the philosophical life, just as Socrates did. Meaningful education depends on who we are and how we develop ourselves as teachers and human beings. A second lesson from the Apology is that teachers should ask themselves whether they have any ulterior motives. Some self-examination may be in order here. Are we easily swayed by the desire to be liked, to be esteemed, or to make money? In many ways, our education system has become fully institutionalized. Teachers do not live in poverty and roam the marketplace like Socrates. Our institutions provide both comforts and restraints that may work to promote or to prevent a Socratic education. A third lesson from the Apology is that it may be helpful to think about education as a communal practice. We do not just educate our students for the duration of 3 or 4 years. We continue to live with them in society at large. They become our future neighbors and, more importantly, our future leaders. We are passing our world on to them. Education is as much about personal development as it is about the transfer of knowledge. It is our job to help students continue to grow in virtue and to remind them not to neglect the important things after their student years. We may start by viewing the university as a community, one that we should work hard at to make a good community. Everyone benefits when this community upholds certain principles that regulate social life, when people strive to do the right thing, and when people live reflectively rather than materialistically. This applies today as much as in Socrates' time. In conclusion, I propose that viewing students as friends, even as part of an unequal relationship, may be a healthier attitude than viewing them as clients or customers, as Christiansen wrote. Today, students are looking for a relationship of trust with their teacher. Socrates shows how to think of our students as friends, and our relationship to students as based on trust and even affection instead of profit. This applies more than ever to education in times of Corona. Instead of trying to sell grand theories or new techniques, it would be helpful to once again consider education as a humane endeavor and to prioritize personal development over promises of power and riches. Okay. Let's see. Is everyone here? Juan Ignacio, hi. Good to see you. Sorry, I didn't have everyone on screen. You're up next, so I invite you to start your paper.
Thank you. I'm sorry for the delay. I was having some technical problems, but it's already fixed. Thank you. I will going to talk about the relationship between paideia, game playing, and eunomia in Plato's Republic. So I'm going to read it because I'm afraid that my English is not that good to speak out. But okay. So in this paper, I would like to examine the relationship between paideia and eunomia in Plato's Republic. These two concepts could seem at odds at the beginning, but as I will try to show, Plato is overly concerned in uniting them and in showing the important role of playing within his educational theory. I was concerned that this topic could fall too far away from the objective both of this conference and of our panel of discussion. I realized that the title of my paper could give that impression, especially when compared to those of my colleagues. But I hope to show that this is not the case. Although I will make some theological points throughout my exposition, I do not want this work to be another paper for specialists concerned with meticulous and frankly unimportant discussions about terminology. Rather, I think that these two concepts, eunomia, good predisposition towards flow, and paideia, game, are central to Plato's mind and play a big role within the Republic. The figure of Socrates is also central to this paper, as I will try to show. Socrates is not a teacher like others. He is one concerned with instructing people to fulfill a position, not to fulfill a position within the society. His educational model does not prepare anyone to seize power through rhetoric or political machinations. His education is instead power in itself. It is a good in its own terms, and not a means towards other objectives. Socrates is a teacher of freedom, and it is in this regard where the central role of playing comes along. There is another reason why I think this paper is suitable for this occasion, and it's a more personal one, and is that I was inspired by my own teaching of a core curriculum class with this topic. Well, I was reading with my students The Little Prince by Antoine Saint-Exupéry. So that's what I wanted also to share this fruit of teaching a core curriculum class that I think is much more important than we usually we feel our role as teachers and for our research also. So the Republic is one of the greatest works on the philosophy of education. The concept of play, game, appeared to be somehow in the margins of the Republic, it doesn't appear as much as, for example, in the laws, and it doesn't play an important role as in that work. It only appears about 8 times, and most of them, the use that Plato gives to the concept is to contrast it with seriousness, with spude. So paideia appears as an action that is not serious. Eunomia has a very similar problem in this work. It only appears 1 time. So it could seem that the comparison is not very central to the work, but I think it is, especially when we consider the paper that Eunomia had within Athenian tradition, Athenian educational tradition. By Eunomia, it is entitled one of the most famous poems of a lyric poet that was crucial to the shaping of the Athenian mind. I am talking about Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, a figure that is irretrievable mixed with legend. Most modern historians agree that it is impossible to separate him from the fictional accounts given from him by their ancient colleagues, but by ancient historians, I mean. But regardless of this, Solon's political activity and thought had an enduring effect in the Athenian mindset. Probably the most reliable witness of what the historical Solon thought are his own poems, from which a non at all worthless part was conserved in fragmentary state by later authors. Solon Eunomia deals with the question of why do the cities, polis, fall. Many authors have realized that he stands against Homer and Hesiod regarding the most likely cause of the destruction of a city. It is not the happy and immortal gods who cause or sanction the fall of the cities. Rather, it is because its citizens' frenzy for wealth and power, and especially because of the madness of those who rule it. It is therefore unjust to blame the gods for the ruin of a city. The cause of its destruction must be intrinsic to itself. Justice, dike, as portrayed by Solon, is an impersonal force that is, and I quote, always silent and aware of the past and present injuries, and its revenge comes always at last. Living turned away from the city, taking refuge in one's own private business is helpless. Nobody can escape from the ruin of the city, for the effects of injustice reach even the most remote chambers of the household. The ruinous state of the city that Solon presents us in this poem is not other than that of Athens in the early 6th century BC, the times that he lived in. Solon lived in a time in which the old aristocracy became at odds with its noble past and gave them preeminence in the first place. To use the city for their own private and egoistic purposes. Thus, the agricultural lands were distributed unjustly. Poor countrymen lived in a state of semi-slavery, and it was not rare that a citizen would be sold to pay his debts. It is mainly against them that the reproaches of the lawgiver are directed. They are those in charge with the city. They were obliged by their noble upbringing to take care of them, but they fell far from their task. The other faction of the polis, the poor and disinherited peasants, were tempted to follow the example of other Greek cities that fall into tyranny. This institution was not other thing than the empowerment of someone, normally a nobleman, to govern in the name of the people, facing the rest of the aristocracy and portraying them as enemies. The tyrant tended to eliminate the differences in the polis, but the worst feature of the tyrant is that he rules at odds with the law, nomos. Here, a precision needs to be made. The word nomos in Greek is not simply reducible to our term law. For the Greeks, there was a sense in which nomos was irreducible to the written norm sanctioned by the state. Law also meant custom and tradition in a broader sense. Thus, eliminating the differences between the nobles and the people meant necessarily to go against the nomos. The difference between the nobles and the people meant necessarily to go against the nomos, the established custom of the polis. This is the situation that Solon wants desperately to avoid. The clash of factions within the polis means the destruction of the polis. Eunomia is the opposite state to this. Without eliminating the differences, opinions, and goals that each faction is entitled to have, Solon puts a greater good in stake, the good of the city. Aristotle clearly refers to this Solonian tradition when he theorizes about the political friendship. Friendship and I quote, "Friendship seems to hold states together, and lawgiver seems to care more for it than for justice." The picture that Solon gives us of eunomia falls far away from that given to us by the epic poets, especially that from Hesiod. Eunomia is not a personal force, a whimsy deity that favors a city or another according to her will. Eunomia is a state of things, the results of the factions giving up their own egoistic goals to achieve the good of the polis. It means good order, fidelity to the principles upon which the city was founded. But it also means concord. It means that the different factions of the polis are correctly disposed one to the other. Despite the difference, the different factions are united by the well-being of the polis. It's with this tradition that Plato connects in the passage that I'm going to analyze from the Republic. Because given the central role that eunomia play in the thought of the Athenian lawgiver, it is not uninteresting at all to ask ourselves about the role that eunomia plays in Plato's philosophy. As I have said, the word occurs just one time in the text, in 425 A3. Now I will quote the entire passage because it's the passage that I'm going to comment in more detail. And I quote, "Then indeed, whenever the youngsters make a good start in their play and admit good order, eunomia, into it through their education in the arts, it follows them everywhere and fosters them. And if there was anything laid down before our state came about, it puts it right." When we compare this passage with the Solonian idea of eunomia, the first thing that strikes us is that eunomia is presented less as a state of things and more as something that resides within someone. To Solon, eunomia is the well state of the polis. A healthy polis is a polis in eunomia. A polis where the factions are mutually phase is a polis in dysnomia. Plato furthers the process of interiorization of the category of the just, initiated by Solon. Solon saw indeed that the just disposition of the city depended upon the actions of those who compose it. It was inherent to the polis. If the inhabitants of the city commit wicked actions, the city will irremediably collapse. Plato here gives a further step. It is not only the external actions that matter, but the very character of the actors must be truly just if the polis is to survive. Many authors have observed that in Plato there is a movement from the just thing, the just situation, to dikaion, to justice, dikaiosine, understood as an internal disposition of the agent towards the just thing. But if this difference between Solon and Plato stands out clearly, the relationship that Plato establishes between eunomia and music is not immediately grasped. Plato states here that eunomia resides in those who have been educated in the musicae. So the translation that I read renders musicae as the arts, which is arguably a good translation in this context. Indeed, to understand what is this musicae to which Plato refers, we have to go back to 392 D and the following passages, where the characters of the Republic start fashioning the proper education, paideia, of the guardians, the class of men and women that are going to overlook the city. This paideia that Plato, Adimanto, and Glaucon propose for the guardians of the city is divided into two different but related spheres: education for the soul and the body, and education for the body. They purpose that musicae, is a discipline that educates the soul, and gymnastics, the discipline that educates the body. Plato is talking here of music in a very broad sense. For Plato, music has three main components: discourse, logos, harmony, harmonia, and rhythm, rhythmos. He considers that the work of the great poets Hesiod and Homer are to be included within this kind of music. Also, theater, the most distinguished Athenian kind of poetry, dithyramb, funeral songs, among others, are considered as part of this kind of education, of this kind of musicae. This is why is this so important to Plato? Eric Havelock, the great British classicist, has noticed that the great deal of importance that Plato puts in music as a tool for education must be understood in part historically. The Athenian culture of the 5th and 4th century before Christ was the result of a process of alphabetization that had been happening in Greece for almost 2 centuries. The introduction of the alphabet marked the beginning of a new era in the transmission of knowledge. Within the alphabet, the relevant experience of a generation, its history, knowledge of the world and science can be written down and preserved. But before its invention, relevant knowledge passed from generation to generation by memory. Music, in this conception, is the opposite to prose. While written prose is a discourse that mimics the day-to-day speech, music is human logos transformed to be memorized. That is why the poet uses rhythm and harmony, which are tools to facilitate the process of memorization. They become a repeated pattern that helps the listener to remember certain logos. It is not at all a coincidence that the Muses, patron goddesses of the art, were held by the Greeks to be the daughters of Mnemosyne, memory. But there is also a more important reason than the historical explanation of Havelock. The pass from an oral to an alphabetized culture explains indeed why versification was replaced by prose as the preferred instrument for the transmission of knowledge, but it does not explain why Plato still holds to the ancient paradigm of basing education in memory. It is true that Plato embraces in many ways the transformations that were taking place at his time. He writes in prose and mimics the day-to-day dialogue in his own works. But he is also aware of the dangers of neglecting memory. The myth of Theuth in Phaedra speaks eloquently of this truth. Written texts can cause one to remember something, but they are not memorized experience as such. Remembering something is not the same as having it memorized. So there is a sense in which memory cannot be replaced. Music, the great mnemonic instrument of the traditional paideia, cannot be therefore neglected. Plato knows, too, that music is most effective with children because that is when, and I quote, that is when the soul is most malleable and when whatever character you desire to be stamped on the individual is fixed. This character, typos, is the result of that musical education, characteristic of an oral culture, that was still very much alive in Plato's time. But the musical tradition cannot stand as it was in Plato's time as education for the guardians. First, there is a problem with the content, logos, of the poems. Hesiod and Homer portray gods, heroes, and men doing weak things and shameful things. Zeus killing his father, Achilles whipping and restrained, etc. These shameful narrations should not form part, in Plato's mind, of the guardian's education. These narrations are unacceptable, since poems should portray models of noble and beautiful ways of acting, instead of making children memorize weak actions as patterns for their own actions. There is also a problem with the lexis, the way of saying things. Here Plato differentiates between 3 different styles of poetry, direct, indirect, and mixed. Direct style is when the poet speaks in first person. He is the one who tells the story. In the indirect style, the poet mimics the voice of the character he's depicting. Theater is the paradigmatic example of this style, where the characters borrow their voices from the actors that play them. An example for mixed style would be epics, in which both the narrator has a voice, but also lends it to the characters. For Plato, who is very much concerned with unity of mind and action, to mimic other voices, especially when one is to mimic a weak man or a lower being, like an animal, should not be allowed as part of his paideia. Finally, Plato acknowledges some problems with the form of the poems. Some poems have a melody that leads to an exaltation of passions that are not proper of a noble character. Thus, he discards harmonies that exaggerate sadness and provoke excessive fear to death, as lamentation and mourning songs. He rules out melodies that lead to idleness and intemperance, as those sung by the Ionians and the Lydians. Plato believes that only simple melodies lead towards a good character. Despite our own evaluations about Plato's purge of the musical arts, it is interesting to notice that he does make a good point in linking music with morality. Jaeger notes that there is a sense in which nomos, law, can mean melody or strain. Plato is trying to identify both meanings. The poems recognized in his educational system are to be considered laws in the moral sense. A soul where eunomia is preserved is like a well-tuned soul. Plato gives preeminence to one sense of nomos over the other. We have said that for Greeks, nomos can mean both law and custom. For Plato, written laws are auxiliary and even unnecessary for those that have been educated under his musical paideia. When talking about judges, for example, he says that the guardians should not be compelled to use their services, for, and I quote, "It is a shameful and strong evidence of lack of education, apaideousia, to be compelled to use the services of a justice brought in from elsewhere as our masters and jurors because of the shortage of homegrown qualities." Thus, in completely interiorizing the notion of nomos and in comparing it to the musical nomos, Plato is proposing his paideia as the true solution for the illness of the polis. Education is the solution for the problem of injustice, and education is the one that can bring the true eunomia to the polis. But it is not clear yet the relationship between eunomia and paideia, play. Why does Plato say that when the youngsters make a good start in their play and admit good, why does Plato say that when the youngsters made a good start in their play, they admit good order, eunomia? As we seem to observe, when we talk about music, we're entirely within the borders of playing. Here, the Germanic languages, such as English, give us a very important clue about this truth. In English, we say, I play the piano, and in German, for example, we say, ich spiele das Klavier. In Greek, as we have said, music is closely related to memory. The Muses were indeed the daughters of Mnemosyne. But there is another interesting connection between the word playing, paisdein, or game, paideia, with our subject matter. In Greek education, paideia and game share the same root, child, pais. As we have shown, music is a vital part of education for Plato. Thus, we can understand why he connects so freely the play of the youngsters, to paisdein, with eunomia in the mentioned passage. Eunomia is received by those souls that play well, that are accustomed to the right nomos that is received in an early education. But are games truly connected with the education that Plato is proposing for his guardians, or this is a mere etymological coincidence? After all, games, is that what children usually do? And education, paideia, is that what we should give to children in order to make them useful members of any society? The connection between both terms could be very well accidental. Does Plato think that playing and education have a deeper connection than their shared root? I think he does, and I will try to show something, and I will try to show how he does it.
Juan Ignacio,
yes.
can I give you 2 more minutes?
Okay, great. 2 minutes. Yes. Sorry. So, I have said that in Plato, it is very common to oppose games to serious activity. For example, in the Republic, he does it in a lot of occasions. In Republic 10, 602 B8, he says, "This then is what we have agreed more or less, that the imitator knows nothing worth mentioning about the objects he is portraying, but that imitation is a kind of game and not serious." Here Plato is opposing paideia to spude, but I think that Brisson is right in pointing out that here the opposition is not absolute, but it is proposed to understand the difference between the myths and the poets that the poet sings and the knowledge that philosophy provides. Myths are like games. They are close to themselves. They provide a context within which everything happens without referring directly to reality. They give a sense of knowing something when in reality they only present us with a copy of the object that we are portraying, that it is portraying. But paideia is not absolutely opposed to seriousness. Games are indeed very powerful tools, and Plato notices that. The passage we have considered at length is an example of this. In fact, Plato notices that it is within the context of games that the most serious violations of the law, paranomiae, can be introduced into the soul. Music, as we have seen, is a kind of game in this sense, a powerful tool for education that can be a vehicle of introduction of novel examples. That is why in 425a, the passage we're considering, Plato speaks about the noble game, to kalos paisne, as a proper vehicle for moral education. Games can be detrimental because within the context of game, it is easy for novel examples to pass unobserved. For the same reason, games are a very powerful ally for education because they create self-referential educational contexts where laws are explained by themselves. So I'm going to jump to my conclusion. I believe all this speaks about the kind of teacher that Plato has in mind. Plato's teacher is concerned with a kind of knowledge that is not a mere instrument, a tool for something else. It is a knowledge valuable by itself. It is worthy regardless of the fruits that it can bring. Because that education is the best fruit, but because that education itself is the best fruit we can attain from it. In this sense, also, it is very similar to playing. Playing is worthy in itself. We play for the sake of playing. An instrument, in fact, can be a very powerful way of having power over something else. It is a source of dominion, of kratos, as the Greek would say. Plato's education is more than that. It is dynamis. It is the capacity of performing activities that are valuable themselves. I believe this is the key point of connection between Plato's educative proposal and playing. They are both activities that are valuable for themselves and that don't need to refer to something outside them to find value. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting paper. I propose we move on to Matthew Post, University of Dallas, and you're going to speak on what kind of poets does Socrates want?
Yeah, sure. And I normally talk too long at these things, so I actually wrote out my talk this time to be respectful of everyone. And so maybe I'll do what you did, Emma, because you guys seem to find that helpful, just putting the talk on the screen.
I think so.
So you can read it with my narration, if that's a bonus. So I'll just put it up. It wasn't designed for that purpose, so you'll notice a few side notes in there, but I'm sure you'll be patient with me. All right, here. I think is that okay. So you guys, you can all see it now, right? It's legible. Okay, great. So just a quick introduction to this. Of course, the critique of poetry in the Republic is very famous. And as you know, there's a lot of different perspectives on Plato. You have those who tend to take it at face value and those that have a more esoteric reading, and sometimes one that seems to contradict the surface of the text. But even between these two groups, everyone tends to treat the critique of poetry as in earnest. The poets really are deficient as regards philosophy. I'm not saying I can fully oppose that interpretation, but I'm trying, this is kind of a prima facie case in the other direction, that in fact, you might find the breadcrumbs of a surprisingly robust defense of poetry from Socrates in the Republic. Okay, in the Republic, there are two major critiques of Homer, one from books 2 to 3 and one from book 10. The earlier critique largely concerns Homer's misrepresentation of gods and heroes. He makes vice seductive, especially through imitation and so on. At the same time, Socrates notes that there may be a hupanoia in Homer, but young people can't know that, right? Bloom translates hupanoia as hidden sense, which is appropriate. We might also think of it as what works subconsciously on us, but perhaps most precisely, Socrates is suggesting that there could be an intellectual truth in Homer's work, which certain, maybe even most audiences don't notice. I'm going to come back to this later. So later in book 10, there's three major charges in the critique. The first, Socrates argues that neither Homer nor anyone educated by him is reputed to have won wars, given good laws to cities, etc. Second, Socrates says that Homer doesn't seem to have made many friends through private teaching. People are convinced that they needed him in order to rule their household or their city. And third, Socrates claims that Homer doesn't lay hold of the truth as regards virtue. In this context, Socrates likens Homer to a painter, claiming that he is a mere imitator, third away from the truth and thus ignorant of virtue. I'm going to return to this later too. So we have our three charges. What are the conditions set forth by Socrates for the defense? I'll quote, "All the same, let it be said that if poetry directed to pleasure and imitation of any argument to give, showing that they should be in a city with good laws, we should be delighted to receive them back from exile. And surely we would also give as protectors, those who aren't poets, but lovers of poetry, occasion to speak an argument without meter on its behalf, showing that it's not only pleasant, but also beneficial to regimes and human life. So poetry must be able to exist within a city with good laws to benefit regimes and human life. I don't wish to address the first two charges at length. Socrates alludes to praisers of Homer as though they're common enough, and it seems unlikely that among these praisers, there is not even one who's helped to win a war or reputed to pass a good law, but let's just leave it. I am more concerned with the third charge because it concerns truth and virtue and is therefore the more serious. So to respond to this, let's turn to book 6, 501a to b. Socrates describes the rule of the philosopher as an education that would seek both a city, both a city and human beings that are akin to a clean tablet, looking toward, quote, the just, noble, and moderate by nature, and everything of the sort, and again toward what is in human beings. And thus, mixing and blending the practices as ingredients, they would produce the andrekelon. Bloom translates it as image of man, but keep in mind that the eikon is a likeness in a precise sense. It is actually to be in some way or another accurate. It's not just any random image. So the image of man, taking hints from exactly that phenomenon in human beings, which Homer too called godlike and the image of a god. Now, it's clear that Socrates is distinguishing the study of what is by nature from what one can learn from Homer. We might conclude that Homer is still removed from the truth. As I mentioned before, Socrates likens him to a painter, third removed from the truth. Besides, Socrates stresses the phenomena, not Homer's poetry, is decisive here. But if this is so, why would the philosopher ruler need to look to exactly the phenomena that Homer called godlike? And why cite Homer at all? Shortly after the passage quoted, Socrates calls the philosopher ruler a, quote, painter of regimes, end quote. But to be called a painter is a reproach, right? And another problem here, we know that neither human beings nor cities can ever be clean slates. Is this an anticipation of the highly unrealistic proposal to banish everyone over 10 years old at the end of book 7? Is this discussion of a clean slate ironic? I'd suggest not. Socrates claims that rubbing out one disposition and drawing another is difficult work. He may be suggesting that the educational work of the philosopher begins by attempting to purge vice. And this is, in fact, exactly what he attempts with Glaucon. If you see, for example, at 399e, when he has Glaucon purge the city that Glaucon himself made luxurious, replacing Glaucon's interest in couches and relishes with gymnastic, warlike music, and a disciplined diet. But why call the philosopher a painter? It turns out not all painters are bad. Only the painter who is too far removed from the truth is bad. At 420c through d, Socrates distinguishes bad painting, which paints things unrealistically, from good painting that paints things as they are, importantly, while attending to the nobility of the whole. Thus, painting things as they are does not mean painting them as diseased or vicious. At 599d, Socrates tests Homer by asking, quote, if you are not third from the truth about virtue, but are also second and able to recognize what sorts of practices make human beings better or worse in private and in public, tell us which of the cities was better governed thanks to you. Socrates indicates thereby that he's open to a painter-poet who's both third and second from the truth. It should be clear in this context that second from the truth has something to do with some concrete knowledge of the world and the ability to convey, as he says here, concrete practices, right? So at 501a to b, he has already indicated that he treats Homer's poetry as exactly what has the potential to benefit communities by being included in education. By citing Homer as an authority when discussing the work of the philosopher ruler, Socrates suggests that one of the cities benefited by Homer is the city in speech itself. So for brevity, I do not wish to explore at length Socrates' account of what it means to be third, second, or first with regard to the truth about virtue, except to note that the one who is third is a mere imitator. The one who is second is suggestively described as a doer and maker is another word for poet. And the one who is first encounters a transcendent being that gives the principles of virtue. Okay, so let's go a little deeper into the relevance of being for education and virtue. Socrates famously distinguishes between the realm of becoming, which is sensible, changeable, and concerns compulsion or force, and that of the beings, which is discerned purely by the intellect, they are unchanging, and they draw us to virtue. Socrates speaks consistently of three major beings: the just, the beautiful, or the noble, that's one being, and the good. Among the ancients, as much as now, the just, the noble, and the good are terms that describe virtue. Between the realm of becoming and that of being is the soul. The soul is changeable, but it can participate to varying degrees in the unchanging beings. This means that any given human soul can be drawn more toward becoming, and thus more toward violence and oppression, or toward being, and thus toward virtue and decency. For Socrates, the good is especially important insofar as it is responsible for our ability to participate in the just and the noble, in effect, to be able to live just and noble lives. How does the good do this? Socrates at first describes it as akin to how the sun illuminates objects for sight and the eyes. Later in book 7, he links it not to sight, but to touch. We literally grasp each being. In book 9, he argues that to participate in being is to know being, which is to know the truth. The greater the participation, the greater the knowledge, the greater the encounter with truth. And again in book 6, he tells Adeimantus that to be a mere contemplator without cultivating laws, which could mean unwritten customs concerning the just, the beautiful, noble, and the good, is to be akin to a blind man, to a bad painter. In other words, seeing, even intellectual perception or philosophic contemplation, is insufficient for Socrates. One must do. But what kind of doing? In accordance with what he said thus far, one must think that virtuous acts, and thus virtuous habits and practices, are key. But in book 6, the inculcating by custom seems to be about education. The one who educates in virtue participates in being, and to participate in being is to know being. Thus, it is not that the one who contemplates the just automatically becomes just. Socrates seems to deny this when he says that the mere contemplator is akin to a blind man. Rather, it is that the one who does or teaches virtue knows being by dint of their activity, not vice versa. So the question, does Homer's poetry teach virtue according to Socrates' standards? In book 7, Socrates characterizes education not as producing prudence, but as turning the soul so that prudence can discern being. According to him, this requires the intellect to turn away from what is purely sensible. This occurs by drawing the attention of the soul to contradictions in sensible experiences, and then to allow calculation to address these contradictions by transcending what is purely sensible. Socrates returns to this in book 10, arguing that Homer's poetry does the exact same thing. However, he condemns this poetry because it never suggests that one should actually turn to calculation. This poetry simply presents confusions and nourishes those parts of the soul inclined to lamentation and self-indulgence. But is this true? Does Homer's work truly not solicit our calculative faculties? Perhaps not in the strictly mathematical sense, but Socrates also depicts calculation as seeking the causes and reasons for events and actions. Many a student of Homer would say, in all honesty, that the works indeed solicited calculation in response to apparent contradictions. This is, in one way, what the study of literature and all our debates concerning it are about. But is this something that we impose on the text because we approach it with a specific, perhaps partially philosophic mode beforehand? Or does Homer's work itself teach us to do this? We might say that it is not Homer, but Socrates who teaches us the proper relationship between desire, spirit, and calculation. But who taught this to Socrates? Believe it or not, Socrates claims Homer as his authority. If you remember this, right? He smote his breast and reproached his heart with word. Quote from Homer, go to book 4, 441, B to C, it's all there. Socrates allows that poetry not only solicits calculation, but also intellect, which is crucial to discerning being and cultivating virtue. So I have the textual citations there, and I note that the word there is dianoia in the Greek. Thus, it turns out that according to Socrates himself, Homer's work exhibits the key features listed for an education that turns the soul toward being, an education in virtue as described in book 7, even though these key features are denied Homer by Socrates in book 10. Except Socrates invites us to defend poetry, and he's actually prepared us to do it. So Bloom has called the Republic the true apology of Socrates. Insofar as Socrates faced accusations from poets, it is a defense of philosophy against the accusations of poetry. There's considerable merit to this interpretation. But I put to you that the Republic is, in the greatest and most charitable tradition of the Platonic Socrates, also Socrates' defense of Homer and of good poetry. There is, just to be clear, there's no defense of Simonides here. He is still a degenerate by the end of the work. Anyway, but a defense of good poetry. Socrates not only defends poetry by speaking overt praise on its behalf at key moments in the text, he also shows us how to uncover and make use of insights drawn from Homer when educating others to attend to virtue. But he's done more than that. Today, when asked to defend education in the great books, I've seen many a seasoned educator balk. They speak of what has stood the test of time, but this is contrary to any properly liberal or philosophic education to simply equate the good with tradition. Not every tradition is good. Better arguments speak to what is universal, but might we not argue that lust and heartache portrayed in Pulp Fiction is universal? So is it just style? And who decides what is good style? And so it goes. We know these debates. Socrates' argument is in a way more precise. Great poetry encourages harmony between desire, spirit, calculation, and intellect. It helps to turn the soul from the merely sensible toward what is also intellectual. It allows us to see virtue and vice as it occurs in human beings, and by dint of soliciting calculation and ultimately intellect, great poetry is great because it facilitates our encounter with being and truth. But if Socrates' critique of Homer's poetry were true, that it only indulges our base passions, then it would not be good poetry. But by giving the critique, Socrates has given us an account of what doesn't belong in the great books. But if Homer is so great, why was there ever a problem in the first place? Because it seems it is possible to educate ourselves so badly that we are no longer able to see the hidden sense, or hupanoia, in great works, as Socrates says. The sophists offer a different approach to understanding art and making. Thinking of Emma's and Juan Ignacio's papers, I will only note that the sophist account must be addressed first and with the utmost care before one can turn to a more salutary understanding. I'm glad you guys went ahead of me. That was helpful. Advocates of great books education would do well to note the many parts of Socrates' defense and wonder whether, if they jettison one part, for example, virtue or being, the rest of the argument they're making does not crumble. In conclusion, let us not forget that Socrates only allows that Homer may be second to the truth, not first. Why? I cannot entirely say, but here's a guess. First is the study of being. If the poet turned to that, they'd become a philosopher proper, not a poet, and their work would accordingly suffer. The good poet works on the imagination to reveal the real patterns of virtue and vice in everyday life, providing the indispensable foundation from which the philosopher can bring in their contemplation of being and grasp the connection between the patterns in the soul and the unchanging beings. Socrates mentions a quarrel between philosophy and poetry, but he does not argue so as to decide the case in favor of philosophy against poetry. Instead, he reveals that the quarrel itself is absurd, as though the foundation should accuse the edifice upon which it is built for lacking profundity, or the tower should demean its foundation for lacking grandeur. The full human life and greatest education requires both. Socrates' activity is not victory by defeating the enemy. As he claims to have done with Polemarchus and Thrasymachus, his victory emerges in fostering alliance and friendship. I believe that is where we find the heart of the philosophic approach to poetry. Thank you.
Thank you for a great paper also. I think we'll have some good discussions later on if we have time, which I hope we do.
I apologize, I was still over time. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, it was fine. Greg is going to speak on what kind of teacher was Socrates.
Thank you. I will try to stick to time. I was told 20 minutes, is that right?
As far as I know, but I could be incorrect. Let me check that.
I've got it.
Officially runs until 10 my time, which would be. Oh, I'm not correct. Okay, I'm glad about that. Okay, the panel runs until 4:45. So try to shoot to 15-20 minutes. Yes.
Perfect. No problem. I think you'll see that my paper will touch on Emma's paper. She talked about Socrates as a friend, but also she touched on his role as teacher. And I'll also connect to Matt's paper because his discussion of Homer fits well with mine. I also hope that my remarks here are somewhat controversial, despite the fact that I'm going to probably say some things that we all accept without reflecting upon them. So this panel is devoted to the many faces of Socrates. One of the faces of Socrates is that of a teacher. He's commonly thought to be one of the best teachers of all time, the most influential, the teacher who's reflected most closely on what pedagogy looks like. And yet his status as a teacher is curious, dubious even. After all, he denied in public that he knew anything at all, and he denied being a teacher as well. What are we to make of these pronouncements? I take these denials to be somewhat ironic. Socrates may not have possessed epistemic certainty about anything, but I suspect that he was quite confident regarding a few matters, including how one ought to live. And I suspect that he shared his views with a few young men around him, whom he considered to be students and friends. This may or may not be a helpful starting point, but I insist that Socrates was a teacher. But what evidence do I have? How did he teach? What did he teach? Of what did his pedagogical activity consist? In this brief paper, I will argue that Socrates was a teacher. Moreover, that he saw himself as a teacher, but that he hid this fact. One reason he hid this fact was that he could be highly selective in choosing students. Next, I argue that the Socratic activity that we tend to associate with Socratic teaching, the elenchus or the Socratic method of questioning and refuting, is not Socrates' principal mode of educating. Rather, the so-called Socratic method was a mode Socrates used to screen potential students, to attempt to determine who among the young was properly suited for genuine education, philosophic education, and to exclude those who were unfit for it. Socrates had little time for students whose capacity or inclination was not up to the difficult task of self-knowledge. Finally, I will offer an account of what true Socratic education looked like, drawing from Plato, but to a greater extent from Xenophon, in particular Xenophon's Memorabilia. So first, my first point, Socrates was a highly selective teacher. He was sort of like the Harvard of Athens. He had a very low acceptance rate. Although he claims in the Apology that he was willing to speak with anybody, we actually seldom see him speaking to ordinary citizens. Socrates usually seeks out two different types of people with whom to speak, young men on one hand, and unconventional types on the other. Very rarely does he converse with a citizen so typical that he is not worth naming, a tyros, a companion. The unconventional types, the sophists, the rhetoricians, the rhapsodes, the philosophers, all of these men who purport to possess some wisdom, these are not Socrates' pupils. We're not going to find his students among this group. Rather, we're going to find his students, I would suggest, among the second type, the young men. So perhaps not present-day Harvard, but Harvard before it became co-ed in 1946. But lest any young man get too smug, it's not even all young men that attract Socrates' attention. Plato usually presents Socrates speaking to young men who were members of the Athenian upper crust, the aristocrats. Xenophon does the same. So in the first place, Socrates seemed to focus on aristocratic young men for potential students. It's probably worth pondering why. Is this actually the class from which potential philosophers are likely to come? Why? Because they're financially liberated from the needs of making a living? Is it simply an unfortunate fact, determined not by nature, but by convention? Would this be the class of men who are likely to have had some kind of previous elementary or elemental education? Perhaps they could read, for example. Of course, in Socrates' most famous account of our education or lack thereof, the Allegory of the Cave, Socrates indicates there that the philosophers will only be able to reach a tiny minority. So this is all to say, the pool of potential students is very dishearteningly small. Let me go a step further. I submit that none of the young men with whom we see Socrates speak in the dialogues were his students. I'll change that just a little bit. We see him with some who may have been his students, Chaerephon, Apollodorus, Aristodemus, for example, but we don't see him engaging in educational conversations with them. Rather, they just sort of exchange pleasantries. Sometimes they help move the drama of a dialogue along. Chaerephon, for example, in the Gorgias, gets the conversation between Socrates and Gorgias off the ground. And by the way, the parallel between Chaerephon and Polus sort of insinuates that Chaerephon was a student of Socrates. I don't think it would be very controversial to say that the usual conversation between Socrates and a young person in Plato takes the form of a dialectical refutation. Socrates, using what's come to be called the Socratic method, refutes a young interlocutor and leaves him in a state of aporia, being at a loss. He does this with Hippocrates and the Protagoras, Charmides and Critias and the Charmides, Theages in the dialogue named after him, and one could go on and on. These conversations, I'm arguing, are not strictly speaking educational. Rather, they're protreptic or propaedeutic, if I can pronounce that word properly. The dialogue that makes this the clearest is the Cleitophon, and Cleitophon levies this as a kind of accusation against Socrates. All that Socrates can do, according to Cleitophon, is refute people and exhort them to pursue virtue. He can persuade a young person to pursue virtue, but then he has nothing to offer a young man who says that he's become persuaded and needs to pursue it. Cleitophon even appears to be somewhat angry at Socrates for not teaching, for merely being protreptic. The Cleitophon takes the form, as others have noted, of a kind of legal accusation, and it ends without Socrates giving a defense of himself. As a brief aside, I think that the reason Socrates is unwilling to teach Cleitophon is because Socrates has a low estimation of Cleitophon's potential. This leads to the following observation. Excuse me. Socrates is quite often dissatisfied with the promising youth around him. He almost always seems to be disappointed in the young people with whom he speaks. Glaucon and Adeimantus let us down on numerous occasions in the Republic. Simmias and Cebes let us down in the Phaedo. By the way, a small tell that an interlocutor has let us down is if Socrates asks, is that argument good enough for you? And they say, sure. This is a pretty obvious in my mind. He says, is this sufficient? They say yes. I'll briefly mention a few more young men and a few more dialogues whose limited potential is revealed early on, and the limitation is then followed by Socrates' explicit refusal to take them on as students. In the Theages' father Demodocus tries unsuccessfully to persuade Socrates to take on his son as a student, but Socrates said his little divine voice told him not to. So this is a nice way out of things, I suppose. In the Laches, Socrates refuses to take on two students who lack promise, Lysimachus and Melesius. These young men are so impressive that even their fathers say they're unimpressive. Critobulus is another example. Socrates never explicitly rejects taking on Critobulus as a student, but the option never seems to occur to his father, Crito, despite being Socrates' friend. Socrates, in fact, tries diligently to persuade Crito to send his son to study with two sophists who seem to be sort of morally nasty fellows, Euthydemus and Dionysodorus. There's at least one Platonic case that potentially undermines my argument, Alcibiades. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. Alcibiades is indeed an interesting case. He seems to have been a very promising young man, but he ultimately fails. He may even have been an erstwhile student of Socrates. Although the symposium indicates that Alcibiades and Socrates had many conversations, I would argue that Alcibiades too shows that Socrates had already given up on Alcibiades as a potential student by then. And I take the dramatic date of Alcibiades II to be the same year as Alcibiades I, so not very much time has passed. There does seem to be, admittedly, some indication from Thucydides that Alcibiades learned rhetoric, possibly from Socrates. This is, by the way, confirmed in the Memorabilia. But again, we still don't ever see Socrates teaching Alcibiades, properly speaking. Alcibiades I is clearly protreptic or propaedeutic. I can't say that word. And Alcibiades' account of all of the conversations he had with Socrates prior to fleeing him sound protreptic as well. Alcibiades doesn't actually recount any philosophic education he received at Socrates' hands. Socrates, according to Alcibiades' account of him, was trying to persuade him to study philosophy or to pursue virtue. And even if you doubt the authenticity of Alcibiades II, I believe there's evidence already in Alcibiades I that Socrates realized Alcibiades' limited potential. Now, one could draw the conclusion here that Socrates was not a teacher. This is not the conclusion that I draw. To the contrary, I suspect that Socrates was a teacher, that he had conversations with his students that had the aim of teaching them, regardless of his disavowals. For some reason, Plato doesn't show these conversations to us, perhaps because they wouldn't have been very interesting, or perhaps because they would be too interesting. Now, for what it's worth, I think we all commonsensically agree that Socrates was a teacher. We might get caught up arguing over sort of minutia. Well, he wasn't a teacher in any ordinary sense. Fine, of course. But aren't we learning from Socrates? Didn't Plato learn from Socrates? Didn't Xenophon learn from Socrates? The problem, of course, for me, is that we never actually see him teach in Plato, and the same can be said for the most part of Xenophon's account of Socrates. Xenophon recounts most of his Socratic conversations in the Memorabilia. There, he presents Socrates benefiting his companions, encouraging them to be continent, reconciling them with friends and family, and exhorting and dissuading individuals to partake in or refrain from politics. My personal favorite is when Xenophon presents Socrates exhorting a young man to eat more vegetables. That's quite humorous, by the way, I think. But Xenophon actually does give us an account of Socrates' teaching, and he's precise to the point of pedantry. The Memorabilia is largely a defensive or apologetic work, but Xenophon shows the reader much more clearly than Plato does Socrates' principal mode of instruction. As he tries to show that his teacher was just, Xenophon shows how Socrates benefited those around him. But Xenophon is at pains to distinguish the concentric circles of those who were around Socrates. Xenophon refers to those in the outermost ring of the Socratic circle as his companions. And as we get closer to Socrates, he has a group of friends and an even closer group whom Xenophon calls Socrates' good friends. Xenophon is fairly circumspect regarding this last group, the good friends. However, once in the Memorabilia, ever so briefly, Xenophon gives us a fairly clear account of what Socratic education looked like. And he shows us what Socrates did with his, quote, good friends. Over the course of a rather long chapter, Book 1, Chapter 6, Xenophon relates a series of conversations that took place between Socrates and Antiphon, a sophist, who is not well disposed towards Socrates. After Antiphon has hurled a series of insults at Socrates, questioning how someone who lives such a pathetic, miserable existence could possibly be happy, and also calling into question Socrates' wisdom, Socrates responds with a quote that is often heard. Now, before I quote it, if you've probably heard it, and if you've ever studied Xenophon, you've certainly heard it. It runs the risk of becoming so familiar that we miss what's controversial in it. So try to see what's novel about this quote. In this quote, Socrates admits to being a teacher, and in what I won't read, he'll also admit to being a politician. He concedes that he teaches, but only to his good friends, and he tells us how he teaches. This is Book 1, Chapter 6, Section 14. Socrates says, Antiphon, just as another is pleased by a good horse or a dog or a bird, so I myself am even more pleased by good friends. And if I possess something good, I teach it, and I introduce them to others from whom I believe they will receive some benefit with a view to virtue. And reading or interpreting collectively with my friends, I go through the treasures of the wise men of old, which they wrote and left behind in their books. And if we see something good, we pick it out. And we hold that it is a great gain if we become friends with one another. End quote. So here in this dispute with the sophist, Xenophon's Socrates admits to being a teacher, something he denies in Plato. And he also makes clear his principal mode of instruction. He reads books with students, friends, good friends, the books of the wise men of old. One might say great books, or core texts if you prefer. Further, Xenophon calls Socrates blessedly happy after having heard him say this. Xenophon thus points to the centrality of this activity to Socrates' way of life and to his teaching. As Thomas Pengel says, quote, Xenophon indicates that learning from the study together of old books, Xenophon indicates that learning from the study together of old books that are great because they contain treasures of wisdom is a peak activity of Socratic life and friendship. Here, finally, we see the virtuous activity that Socrates did not merely turn his companions toward, but effectively lead them into. End quote there. So while Socrates may have engaged in dialectical battle to test the mettle of students, if he admitted them to Socrates' school, if they became Socrates' friends, his primary avowed mode of instruction was the collective study of great books, which would undoubtedly raise a host of questions for student and teacher to discuss in conversation. Furthermore, we don't need to wonder what kind of books Socrates would have read with his students. Xenophon gives us fairly clear indications, as does Plato, by the way. Xenophon gives us reason to believe with confidence that Socrates read the works of two main groups with his students, the pre-Socratics or natural philosophers on one hand, and the poets on the other. With his students, Socrates read the works of Homer, Hesiod, and Simonides on one hand, and Zeno, Parmenides, and especially Anaxagoras on the other. And this, by the way, should show us something about Socrates' chief interests: theology, natural science, epistemology. References to Homer and Hesiod abound in both Xenophon and Plato. In Plato's Protagoras, we know that Socrates has memorized poems of Simonides. As I believe Matthew just told us, Socrates admits that he's loved Homer since he was a child in the Republic. And with respect to the pre-Socratics, he took great interest in Zeno and Parmenides, and we know that he was also especially interested in Anaxagoras. So to be clear, I think that Socrates conversed with young men in this manner, in the manner we are accustomed to seeing him do so, in part because he's seeking out promising students. In almost all of the cases we see in Plato, the interlocutor fails. But to those select few who make it through, who pass the test, who reveal to Socrates some character of soul, intellectual curiosity, humility, or courage, a recognition of one's ignorance paired with an openness to learn, in any event, these happy few gain admission to Socrates' school. And while it seems to be the case that these would have engaged in conversation, what's less obvious is that the source of the conversation would have been the collective study of great books. With his students, Socrates examined the treasures left behind by the wise men of old to expose his students to fundamental alternatives or permanent questions. Here at the annual meeting of the Association for Core Texts and Courses, I conclude with very good news, flattering news. You, if my argument is correct, if you read with your students the treasures of the wise men of old, which they left behind in their books, if you pick out and analyze the good parts with them, not only have you made a great gain and a great friend, but you are also engaged in Socratic education. To the extent that you meet with young people and engage in serious reading of core texts or great books and go through those treasures of the wise men and women, you are continuing the tradition of Socratic philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg, for the paper. We're going to move on to the final paper by Miguel Solans on Socrates' attitude toward death.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen with you if I can. Here, okay. Okay, perfect. So, well, as you all can see, I'm going to talk about a very radically different topic than the questions or the topics discussed before. I hope not to sound so depressing because I will be discussing death, but at the end, I can assure you, it will. I mean, it will sound better. So I'm going to read it. So one of the most dramatic consequences of the current corona crisis seems to be the emergence of a collective awareness of our mortal condition, accompanied with various degrees of fear and anguish. It seems worth asking, therefore, what we can learn from core texts about the end of life and what answers we may find in them concerning the many questions around death. The text I have chosen to reflect on this topic is Plato's Phaedo, a dialogue focused on Socrates' last conversation right before his execution with some of his friends. In that exchange, Socrates discusses many philosophical topics, such as the arguments for the immortality of the soul or the so-called theory of ideas, that will play a fundamental role in Plato's philosophical system, as we all know very well. In contrast with the speculative nature of these questions, I believe, however, that at the core of the Phaedo lays a much more practical concern: the question about what kind of attitude the philosopher should have towards his own death. As far as I see, we find a clear indication of this in the fact that both the starting and the closing questions of the dialogue are the same. Namely, is Socrates right in accepting his death as he does, fearless and happy? Faced with this question, Socrates offers in the first pages of the Phaedo an apologia for his own way of dying. In what follows, I shall first offer a brief analysis of the two main arguments used by Socrates to justify his attitude towards death. And second, I will attempt to sketch out a very, very preliminary answer to the question raised in the previous analysis, about the relationship between philosophy and religion in Socrates' attitude towards death. To do so, I will draw our attention to a passage in the final section of the dialogue. And so, well, before going on, I have to say that this is a very early draft of a larger paper I would like to write on the relationship between philosophy and religion in Plato's thought. So here are some preliminary or very, very early thoughts on this topic in the Phaedo. For those who are familiar with Socrates' way of conversing in Plato's early dialogues, it will be surprising, I guess, that the starting point of his argument of defense is to be found in a religious belief that Socrates merely assumes as true and that will remain unchallenged for the rest of the dialogue. He claims that it is right for him not to resent death because he believes that in the afterlife he will enter the company of good and wise gods as well as the company of good people. He immediately adds that this is the reason why he is optimistic that there is something in store for the dead, and as we have long been told, something much better for the good than for the bad. According to this, Socrates' attitude towards death appears as the embodied expression of his belief that there is an essential connection between the moral quality of our earthly life, on the one hand, and our future well-being after death on the other. Now, that this belief is the most reasonable one for Socrates to hold as true is far from obvious, and as Simmias rapidly points out, requires further justification. The next 5 Stephanus pages of the Phaedo are devoted to Socrates' attempt to convince his friends that he's right in believing that this is the case. To do so, he offers 2 different arguments, each of them relying on a different source of evidence. While the first proof is based on beliefs established as the result of philosophical inquiry, the second depends on purely religious premises, as we are about to see here. Socrates' declared aim of his first argument is to persuade his friends that it is reasonable for a philosopher to face death with courage and with the hope that he will win the greatest goods in the afterlife. His reasoning can be very briefly summarized as follows. First, death is the separation of soul from body. Second, only after the separation of soul from body will it be possible to acquire the fullness of wisdom. Third, the philosopher is a lover of wisdom and he does everything to acquire it. Fourth, the philosopher knows that it will be possible to acquire pure wisdom only after the separation of soul from body. And finally, fifth, therefore, the philosopher will meet death happily. As we see, Socrates' first argument relies on the fact that wisdom is the highest value for a philosopher, as well as on the fact that the philosopher knows that wisdom is the excellence of the intellectual capacity of the soul. According to common experience, the exercise of the intellectual capacity of the soul is hindered by bodily sensations and desires. To the extent that it is agreed that death is the separation from soul and body, death will thus be seen as leading the philosopher towards the acquisition of wisdom in its purest form. Therefore, it seems reasonable to think that the philosopher should welcome the separation of soul from body. The conclusion of the argument is presented as follows. Yet will someone who is genuinely in love with wisdom and has strongly conceived the same hope that nowhere but in others will he have a worthwhile encounter with it, resent dying and go there less than cheerful? One can only think he will not, at least if he is really a lover of wisdom, my friend. For he will be quite sure that he will have a pure encounter with wisdom nowhere else but there. And if this is so, as I was just saying, wouldn't it be extremely irrational if someone like that were to fear death? As already suggested, the second argument differs in nature from the first one. It might be reconstructed as follows. First, philosophers are the only ones who possess true virtue, it is wisdom. Second, to possess wisdom is to be truly purified. Third, those who arrive in others purified will live with good gods. Fourth, therefore, philosophers will live with good gods in the afterlife. And fifth, therefore, Socrates is right not to grieve, for he will live a better life after his death. As we can see, two assumptions seem to be central to this proof. First, the equation between being wise and being purified. And second, the belief that only the purified wise souls will dwell with good gods in Hades. At first glance, one might think that this argument merely expresses the philosophical results of the first argument, but in a religious language that is shared both by Socrates and his interlocutors. If this were the case, as some argue, then Socrates' second argument adds nothing valuable to the first one. It has been suggested, moreover, that the only reason why Plato introduced Socrates' second argument is because he was anxious to reinforce the case for saying that Socrates was not irreligious. From this perspective, then, the religious beliefs introduced by Socrates so far are to be considered as unnecessary and expendable, for they provide no substantial support for his defense. In what follows, I would like to argue with some very preliminary reasons for a more positive interpretation of the role of Socrates' second argument. To do so, I would like to focus first on the closing passage of the second argument. I'm sorry because it's too long, but I think it's somehow necessary. The reality is, I suspect that temperance, justice, and courage are a kind of purification from everything like this, pleasures, fears, and everything else like that. And that wisdom itself is a kind of right to purify us. So it actually seems that those people who established the rights for us are no ordinary people, but in reality have been long setting a riddle when they say that whoever comes to others without initiation and the rights will lie in filth, whereas someone who arrives there purified and initiated will dwell with gods. For in fact, as those involved in the rites put it, many carry the final wand, but few are inspired. The latter, in my opinion, are none other than those who have pursued philosophy correctly. In trying to become one of them, I left nothing undone in my life, at least as far as I could, but did my utmost in every way. Whether I did so correctly and achieved anything, I'll know for certain when I've got there, God willing, and I don't think it will be long. This then, Simmias and Cebes, is what I say in my defense to show that it is reasonable for me not to be upset or resentful at leaving you and my masters here, as I believe that there too, no less than here, I'll meet good masters and companions. Sorry for the long quote. In contrast with the conclusion of the first argument, where we were told that the genuine philosopher is sure that he will encounter wisdom in the afterlife, in this passage, Socrates makes it clear that the philosopher possesses no certainty about his encounter with the gods in the afterlife. This passage seems to suggest, therefore, that religious belief is meant to play a different role than the one played by philosophical argument. To further clarify this, it might be useful to go to the last section of the Phaedo where Socrates returns to this point. And this is the concluding section of my paper. After having agreed with his interlocutors on philosophical grounds that the soul is immortal, Socrates introduces a long eschatological myth to explain that after death, the soul of those who have lived a good life will dwell with gods and do well. At the end of the myth, Socrates puts forward the following considerations that, as far as I see, are crucial to the question raised before. Now, it does not befit a man of intelligence to insist that these things described in the myth are as I have described them. However, since the soul turns out to be immortal, I think that for someone who believes this to be so, it is both fitting and worth the risk, for fair is the risk, to insist that either what I have said or something like it is true concerning our souls and their dwelling places. One must, so to speak, chant such things to oneself, which is why I myself have been drawing out my myth for a long time. Anyhow, these are the reasons why a man should be confident about his own soul if he is one who in his life ignored other pleasures, but pursued the pleasures of learning, and adorning his soul not with an adornment that belongs to something else, but with the soul's own adornment, namely temperance, justice, courage, freedom, and truth, and thus awaits the journey to Hades as one who will make it whenever destiny calls. In this passage, Socrates clearly distinguishes the role of philosophical argument from that of religious belief. As far as I can see, according to these words, philosophy does not provide any secure evidence proving that the soul of those who have lived a philosophical existence will do well in the afterlife. What philosophical reasoning provides to those who have lived a morally good life is not full certainty, but a disposition to take the risk of believing that the religious vision of the afterlife is substantially true. To conclude, we are led to assume then that Socrates dies fearless and happy, not because he knows that he will do well after death, for he does not know, but because he, as someone who has lived a philosophical life, finds himself in the best position so as to take the risk of believing so. This is my conclusion. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Also, I think we have papers that will easily be entered into conversation with one another. We're a rather relatively small group, so you can raise hand, or if it's quiet, then just open your microphone and go ahead. Paul.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Good to see everybody. It's nice to be back at a ACTC roundtable, if virtually. I wish we were going out after, but I'll save that for another day. Anyway, this question is for Greg. Greg, is the meaning of the elenchus exhausted by its propaidutic function?
Yeah, sure. First, yeah, I'm sad that we're not swimming in the Pacific Ocean again, Paul, after this conference. Story for another time. No, of course not. I think another aspect of it is Socrates' testing of people to see. So it's sort of Socrates testing himself as well. So if someone claims to possess some sort of knowledge or wisdom, it's one way Socrates can confirm to himself that this person may not know what he thinks that he knows. So it's a kind of path to Socratic self-knowledge as well. Yeah, is that helpful, or did you have other things in mind?
It is helpful. I mean, I'm just curious about how you picture Socrates' use of the elenchus in settings like Euthyphro, for example.
Yeah, so I was schematizing it. I don't know if this is helpful, but the way that he uses it with a young person versus the way he uses it with someone who purports to possess some knowledge or wisdom. So that when he's doing it with a young person, it's to sort of show the young person that the young person doesn't know anything, to see if they'll then pursue education with him. When he uses it with someone, so like Euthyphro, who claims to be a prophet, right? So let's see if he can actually back up this claim to prophecy. And I think when Socrates, in the Euthyphro, for example, it's fairly soon Socrates realizes that Euthyphro doesn't know what he's talking about. I think it's an interesting question for why he continues the conversation at that point. But yeah, who wouldn't want to talk to someone who claimed to speak to God, right? Yeah.
Sorry,
there are probably others, Paul, too, by the way. There's just the two that immediately spring to mind.
So I've got a question for Matt Post. So Matt is turning toward being the only distinctive feature of the philosophic life vis-a-vis poetry? By which I mean, is the poet, or does the poet have the same attitude toward his way of life in relation to that of all others that the philosopher has to his way of life? Another way of putting it is, does the poet champion his way of life vis-a-vis all others in the way that the philosopher does?
Yeah. Oh, no, go ahead. No, go ahead. What else were you going to say?
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh, okay. I would say, I mean, the short answer would be no, not to my reading. There are still significant differences between the philosopher and the poet as educator. One thing I would probably throw out quickly, and if you wouldn't mind, Josh, just responding to this, and then I'll go to the next step. But I am a little skeptical that the philosopher would recommend their way of life to everyone. And even drawing on what you said, Greg, from yours, that in fact, he doesn't recommend it to virtually the vast majority of people. But I get your point, Josh. It's very clear that he thinks the life of the philosopher is the best life. That is something which is emphasized. Whereas you don't entirely get the sense from Homer that the life of the poet is the best life, right? That's not what is presented by the poet. Is that what you had in mind with your question?
Another way of putting it is that it seems as if part of what the poet does is to relish understanding all ways of life rather than offering one that transcends all others.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I think this is important too. And it's kind of a complicated question. I'll try to keep it simple and to the point. When in book 6 of the Republic, Socrates, well, end of book 5 into book 6, Socrates says, and you'll remember this, Josh, too, that the philosophic nature isn't finicky about what they want to know. They want to know everything, about absolutely everything. But it is clear, to Josh's point, that their taste becomes refined in the process, right? And eventually they do let go of interest and knowledge of a lot of things, right? He says eventually they focus on the soul and then they focus on being. And if I'm understanding your question correctly, the poet is not like that, right? The poet throughout their career may continue to be interested. I always have to restrain my worst impulses here. Interested in, the way entrails look when they fall on the ground and stuff like that, which is not necessarily going to be of interest to the philosopher in the same way. Or as you say, the details of all the arts that you can find in Homer, all the other stuff. So that does seem to be a major difference. And I think it's one reason why Socrates, I mean, I'm shooting a bit from the hip when I say this, but I think it's one reason why Socrates actually might be endorsing the poet, or at least giving the grounds for an endorsement of a poet like Homer in the Republic. It's precisely because the philosopher isn't interested in all of those things that the philosopher would fall short if all you had was the philosopher. You actually could not live a full life, possibly even live a proper life of virtue without the poet. And that's something I was trying to touch upon at the end, is that the philosopher really makes a huge contribution by turning toward being and saying, you know what, nobility is real. Because if all you had was the poet, you might doubt it. But once you have some confidence that beauty is real or justice is real, there's so much more rich that you can get out of your reading of literature. But the discipline necessary to even make the suggestion that beauty or justice is real, the kind of intellectual discipline, the argumentative discipline, is something which, if the poet pursued that, it would destroy the work of the poet. So ultimately, the argument is that what you just said about the poet and the philosopher, I think, is correct. And I think that for that reason, they are complementary, because the one cannot pursue the way of life of the other without destroying what makes them great. Does that make sense, or does that answer your question? Yeah.
I have a small point. I don't know how related it is. I think it's related. I was reading Works and Days recently, and my impression there is, in fact, that Hesiod does, maybe not overtly, but recommend his way of. In other words, the whole poem is him encouraging his brother to go out and work hard. But I can't help but think, well, that's not what Hesiod does. And so I'm just inclined to think that actually there is a sort of praise of the poet's life in there. That's to appear. And I think it's implicit in Homer too, for what it's worth, but that's less obvious even in Homer than in Hesiod, I would say. And I do think that if they're making these, sorry, one last point. If they are making these concepts in any serious way, I think that would require either an examination into nature or an awareness, a self-conscious awareness of their role as makers of categories.
Yeah, I was going to briefly kind of follow up on what you said, Greg, to say that I am open-minded to that thought that, for example, the shield of Achilles, there really is a sense there, or I do get a sense that Homer is like, I am presenting the cosmos to you, but the reason why I sometimes hesitate to go down there, so even though you and I actually might agree on that, is I'd have difficult defending it if someone wanted to be really strict with me, because Homer, as you said, it's subtle. It's almost like the moments of my craft are so great, how can I but inspire you to try and emulate what I do? But that depends upon the assumption that the reader is so inspired, which I think is a fair assumption, but someone could rake us over the coals. The Hesiod is very helpful. Thank you.
Hey, Greg. I have just a question. Are Platonic dialogues the kinds of things that Socrates, were they to have existed, would they be the kinds of things he would read with his friends? Given that they're with substandard human beings, and I mean, I think there's an answer. You probably anticipate that I think there's an answer to this question, but I'd just like to hear what you have to say about it.
That's a great question. I suspect the answer is yes, because I think that there's still access or entry points into understanding. And so even Euthyphro, right? There's a whole lot that Euthyphro doesn't strike me as a very impressive interlocutor at all. But the conversation between Socrates and Euthyphro might give us some of the most direct insight into some of the deepest Socratic insights about piety that we have. I suspect that Plato wrote these with a view to these would read together. Yeah. Did I freeze up?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I saw a bunch of blank stares, and I was like, I said something really wrong.
No, it's. I think we lost you for about 5 seconds there in the middle.
Oh gosh, that was the important part. That was
yeah. Well,
go ahead.
Well, the reason I asked the question is I just think, well, this dovetails in a way with Matthew's topic in a way, in that one of the criticisms that Socrates seems to have of the poets in Book 10 is that they cannot represent the decent man, right? They always represent these kind of substandard human beings, as it were, because, decent men are kind of boring, I guess, this would be the reason for it. And so I think, well, maybe the only kinds of books that Plato could have written that Socrates would want to read with his students are not Socrates with his good students, about Socrates with his good students, but Socrates with the people who are not quite qualified for one reason or another to be its good students. Yeah.
I think that's really good. One of the books I think he read was Hesiod, just based on what's happening in those passages in Xenophon. But I was reminded of what would it have looked like? It might have looked like Socrates reading books with his students, and then that's sort of boring, I think we would say.
If I may jump in too briefly to that, I think you're quite right. It's difficult to prove it precisely, but one of the things I was trying to show in my paper is that he actually does think that virtue shines forth in Homer, right? With that point of the philosopher ruler looks to what is called the godlike in Homer. And this kind of goes back to Josh's question that, of course, what everyday people object to in all of this is that the way it's all presented in the Republic isn't really helpful in living a better life, because it just abstracts from too many real world details that I have to deal with. So one of the things I was trying to argue in my paper is that I actually think Socrates might recognize that. And his denuding poetry of everything that makes it actually helpful and worthwhile is solely for the sake of getting us to this one moment in which you can start to believe there's a truth about virtue again. But if you can get there, then it is absolutely essential to restore the rest. Because as you were just saying, Norman, how are you really going to understand virtue or pursue virtue unless you have some sense of how it occurs in real human beings, which means in mixed souls, right? And you see some attempt of Socrates to come to terms with this in Book 8, right, with his account of the descent, and how complicated and messy real souls are.
I'm gonna just throw something out there, also connecting a bit to Juan Ignacio's paper and Miguel's paper, in the sense that when I think we talk about poets, mainly we're referring to maybe actual contemporary poets like Homer and Hesiod. But is there also a sense in Plato that, in a way, Plato himself is a bit of a poet as well as a philosopher? And I'm thinking, but maybe I'm blurring boundaries here. But so Miguel talked about, well, an eschatological myth, and I think myths in Plato are often actual myths that were around, but that he also uses certain poetic license sometimes to modify myths. So maybe there we do see sort of Plato acting not strictly as a philosopher, but also who has a fine sense of well, poetry, rhetoric, and maybe also myth making. I guess that also blurs the line, the distinction a bit between philosophy and religion. So I'm not sure how helpful that is, but maybe Miguel can comment on that. And then I was thinking of Juan Ignacio's paper, because the nomoi, which is also about eunomia, of course, and where music also plays a role, because the texts of the nomoi are set to music. And I think what you pointed out is that memory plays a really important role in that. And also, I think the sort of the internalization of a certain harmony or of the laws, because we absorb things more deeply in a way, and also on an emotional level if it's set to music. But there also the question arises, I think, if the lawgiver is strictly a lawgiver. There's this big question whether the lawgiver is also a philosopher. Of course, Socrates not in the dialogue, but can we somehow conceptualize of the Athenian stranger as a philosopher? And not just that, but also again, yeah, can you think of laws, maybe that's pushing it a little bit, but think of laws in terms of the arts as well, at least, maybe not strictly poetry, but since music plays a role. So maybe Miguel and Ignacio could comment on that, and then Matt maybe too.
Yeah, so thank you, Emma. Thank you very much for the question. Your question reminded me of a passage at the beginning of the Phaedo, which I wanted to introduce somehow in the paper, but at the end I couldn't. And is a passage very well, at least for me, a very strange passage, where Socrates says that he has had some dreams, well, during his life, where he thinks that, well, he usually thought that the gods were telling him that he should compose music, he should do music, and he usually interpreted this as you should do philosophy, and he says so. I usually interpret that on the grounds that philosophy is the greatest music, and so that was what I was doing. But just in case my interpretation was not the right one, and they were ordering me to write actual poetry, so to tell stories, then I'm now at the end of my life kind of writing some stories, so just in case. And I think that this is maybe a sort of joke that Plato is kind of presenting here, but at the same time I think that it actually says something about what he's doing in the Phaedo, and about the ambivalence, or the essential ambivalence of philosophical inquiry, which kind of relies on rational grounds, but also on stories and tales and ancient traditions, and so I think this ambivalence is essential to the Phaedo. And yes, what I was trying to clarify is how actually the philosophical attitude and the religious attitude can be articulated. So I actually don't know how how they can actually be combined, but I think that the Phaedo presents some clues to understand that. So I'm working on it, but I think that this is a very interesting approach to the Phaedo.
Yes, and what you say, sorry, Emma, I think it's true. It's like there is, of course, poetry. So in the laws can be a kind of poetry in the sense, especially if we're talking about the lawgiver. So I think here there's another very interesting suggestion in Aristotle that shares a lot of light into this problem when he says that he distinguishes between two kinds of lawgivers, those that give a constitution and those that just give laws. So in that sense, for example, Solon it's not just a lawgiver, a giver of I don't know, written norms, but also a giver of a constitution. Like the lawgiver is the one that makes explicit from an ethos what the city needs now. So in that sense, and Solon is like the paradigmatic case because he doesn't only give like oral commands like Lycurgus, for example, but he writes poetry. So in that sense, I do believe that Plato and in this I agree with Matthew. I think that Plato doesn't rule poetry out of the game absolutely. I don't think that he's so sympathetic with Homer and Hesiod as he is, for example, with Solon. At the beginning of the Timaeus, he regrets that he didn't finish his great poem on the war between the Atlantida and Athens. So I think that Plato is, yes, and he regards some part of the tradition of the poetic tradition, even some parts of Homer and maybe Hesiod, I don't know, as good poetry, but he yearns for a better one. And probably, yeah, and in that sense, as Miguel says, philosophy is the best kind of poetry, right? So he is writing poems in some way in that broad meaning that I was talking about. Yeah.
Thank you both. It's very helpful. I saw both Matt and Greg wanting to intervene, I think. Go ahead.
Okay, I just had a quick follow-up question for Mikael. As you were talking about the philosophic approach and the religious approach, and I'm wondering if you would care to talk more about the philosophic approach, the arguments that Socrates makes, maybe deficiencies in those arguments, right? To what extent do you think that what he says in the Phaedo is a proper presentation of philosophy? Or do you think it might be a deficient like obviously I'm suggesting an answer here, but do you think it could be a deficient presentation of philosophy, or what do you make of how he's presenting it with regard to his interlocutors? If you would just be willing to expand a bit more on this from what you said in your paper.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, well, I don't know if it's deficient presentation of philosophy, as you seem to suggest. I think, it's a discussion which is deeply marked by the context in which Socrates is discussing. So he's discussing with Pythagorean philosophers. So he's trying he's building his arguments upon, I think, agreements he can make with them. So, and maybe some of these agreements are not so, I don't know, but philosophically not so satisfactory for us, or I know. But I think as a philosophical conversation, I think is quite, at least for me, sufficient, so to speak. We can deepen into the agreement. So, and that's what the conversation, I think, is what the conversation does. So they kind of go back to the arguments and then try to clarify what the grounds are for believing that the soul actually survives death, and so on. So I think that the philosophical movement is the philosophical direction of the conversation is okay. I mean, it's at least for me sufficient. But of course, we can always discuss more and more the basic agreements upon which they build the arguments. So, yeah.
I'll jump in just because my question, I think, is sort of in line with Matt's. When Socrates says, gosh, I listened to the gods and they told me to make music, and maybe I've been interpreting that wrong my whole life. Isn't that deeply problematic for how he's lived his whole way of life?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
When he says, I'm going to make music.
Yeah.
Is this better? If I turn the video off, maybe my sound is better?
Yes, now it's better.
Yeah? Oh, okay. Okay, good. So the exhortation to make music that he heard from the gods, this seems to radically call into question that here he is facing death and he realizes maybe he's...
We lost you again.
Yeah, and I think if I heard the question correctly, originally is...
I give up.
Is that not problematic for his entire life? So if he finds out near the end that he should have been doing poetry.
Okay, yeah. So I think it may sound, of course, problematic, but from reading the whole dialogue, I think that the message of this early warning is that at the core of philosophical life is or should be the doubt that philosophy can explain everything. So that's how I read it. So that Socrates is aware that philosophy is not cannot provide us with all the questions that we have at in the deepest heart of our existence. And so I think that recognizing this is part of philosophical life. That's how I read it. But of course, it sounds it may sound problematic in some sense. Yeah.
I think we're almost out of time, but I think we have time for one more question. Paul, I see your hand raised.
I just have a follow-up to Miguel, and then a question for Emma and Greg. Miguel, how then do you take Socrates' comments during the autobiography sequence, which suggests that he was already aware of the limits of at least his philosophic predecessors in terms of their ability to understand nature, for example, and that he conceived of his way of life as an alternative path, an alternative course? That's just one of the things that I want to say. To Emma and Greg, do you think that Socrates has other motives for pursuing his friends, apart from the desire for friendship itself? And Greg, specifically, you would say, based on your comments, that people like Simmias and Cabes are excluded from the inner circles of Socrates' companionship or educative efforts. How then would you characterize his motives towards these types?
Okay, so I answer first.
Yeah, and I was just reminded that we are almost out of time, and I think not sure what happens then. But
okay, so maybe I can give up. So I just think that I should think more about that. But I think that we can make it. I think it's compatible somehow that the philosophical attitude Socrates has towards his predecessors is the same as the one he can apply to himself. But I have to think more about that. Thank you for the question.
I also really appreciate your question, and I think in the apology there seems to be something else than just friendship that results from. There's a strong sense is that somehow this is his role in life in a way, or this is his, he says it as this is my mission from the God. So there's some sense that he can only live this life, the life of philosophy, and not another life. I don't know exactly how to put that, but I think so. It's not just about friendship, but it's almost existential in a way, I think, for Socrates, or it is existential, without considering the benefits or the side effects. I'd like to thank everyone for the panel, especially the people who presented, but also the audience. I think it was a great panel, also very coherent with all the contributions. So really enjoyed it. And yes, I wish you a good evening if you're in Europe, and a good afternoon if you're in America. And it was great to see you all.
Thanks.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Emma. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
So.
Hey, Paul.
Greg, is this thing going to boot us off or what?
I think so. I saw something about we can go to some mingle place.
Oh, yeah?
I don't know what that means.
Yeah, you can go to sorry, I'm the tech moderator, and we use the same rooms for multiple back-to-back sessions, so you wouldn't get kicked off. But yeah,
so we get a roll.
Yeah, you can go to the Mingle tab in the Socio app, and there's different rooms. They have labels by topic, but those are kind of fast and loose. So if you want to talk there, you're welcome to.
All right.
All right.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Good.
Take
It's
care.
good to see you. Greg, it's great to see you. I got to go tend to my kids.
All right. See you, Paul.
Are you at home? Are you at home?
I am. Yeah.
Your home looks attractive.
This is my shed. I've retrofitted it for an office.
It looks great, man. It
Thanks.
looks great.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right, brother.
Well,
I'll see you later.
Yeah, hopefully at some point in the flesh.
Yeah, I'd love to come out and visit.
Please, yeah. You got Alex out here.
You? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We'd love to
All right.
see you.
Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye, Paul.